Okay, cool. Hi. Doing okay. How are you? We're good? Okay. Oh, fuck. Okay. So hi. Thanks for coming. So I want to thank everybody for being here. I also want to thank GaymerX for having me, and it's very weird to be a boss of honor at an event that I'm a big fan of, but it's very appreciated. So what is this talk? So who am I actually? So I am a designer and artist working on a game called, oh, that's awful. Well, whatever, I'll use this. Artist working on a game called Treachery Beatdown City that is not pictured. The game is set in a fictionalized version of New York City called East Fulton, and some aspect of the game had been in development since I got the bug in 2009. It's a game where I decided to make sure that we have a diverse cast of players, diverse cast of enemies, and that also deals with my own personal strife in the city, dealing with people, dealing with billionaire mayors, dealing with cops and cop murders. These paintings are from Harlem Renaissance artists, and dealing with the protests that come from those cop murders, mass capitalism, and all the while just trying very hard to get by. I also made an offshoot game called Corporate Vandals. This was for NYU's No Quarter. They commissioned me to work on this, and it's a 15-foot long multiplayer board game. Each board is 30 by 30, and it's about the real-life ongoing struggle between graffiti artists, corporations that co-opt their tactics, nonprofit organizations who are anti-corporate vandalism, and the city that has a propensity to be very anti-public art even when it's commissioned. Here you can see the game before it was ever played, before No Quarter 2014 began, and this is it being played at Indiecade East. The next year at the Museum of the Moving Image, you see fellow boss of honor Maddie Bryce in there with a sticker on her back. The game got very messy, and it's also the game's also very much inspired by things that actually happen in real life. Like, I used to work at Rockstar Games, and I would walk to work and I would see these anti-corporate vandalism stickers pasted over corporate vandalism by the company that I was working at, and I kind of just laughed because it was very true. And actually I left out one picture, the picture on the left. There's another picture of that where someone spray painted over the sticker. So I just think, the layers of what's going on there is very interesting. How oftentimes Rockstar stickers would be on top of some like independent artist sticker. So this talk is about things I've learned while making these games, which have involved me reaching back decades into the history of video games, but also influenced by a large swath of media that I've experienced in the last decade in particular. This talk is also to inspire people to look at the city as a place where they can set their games, where we can explore and break down things that they love about cities, the mystery, the unrest, the cultural diversity. And if you don't make games, I'd also just like to ask that you look at games that feature the city, or look for games that feature the city, to get you to appreciate what goes into making a city. Because I think something that's interesting and has been a little frustrating for me is that as games have, I guess, more and more people have been making them, a lot of it can tend to just be like cute thing in cute land and have basically no message whatsoever. And that, like, people are just like, video games are this thing. And I think that, they can say a little more. And I just like to see, those games are fine, obviously, but I just like to see more games. Especially, growing up, I saw games like this, Bad Dudes, set like it's two guys that have to go rescue Ronald Reagan. And it's a very weird, like, premise, and, Night Court, I grew up with this show. It was a very weird show, but I don't know, like, it just always had lots of different people on it. And then, had Ninja Turtles, which, kind of changed my life. Like, it was like a live action movie with puppets and all these things, and dealt with dealt with class. I feel like the Ninja Turtles actually, especially, even though they were created to basically be like what was the weirdest thing that the creators could come up with, they end up as being like other looking people that kind of have to live underground because they have these exceptional tactics and tools that are really obsessed with Japanese culture and also American pop culture. They could also be a metaphor for the Black American experience. So yeah, this was my first job. I used to work at Rockstar, and it was kind of interesting because I worked on trailers there, and my first job was actually just to get to know the city that was in GTA 4 and also in Midnight Club Los Angeles. And this was actually the first trailer that I worked on.
Welcome to Bravo, Barazzaru!
Come in, come in!
This is the mansion?
The mansion is coming, cousin. That's the dream.
What do you mean?
We're going to the top, Nico. Soon, even you will forget about the old country.
Some money.
Hey, Nico.
Move up, ladies.
So, where are you taking me?
Bling, check. Bodies, check. Paper, check. That's how we roll. Where are you, Roman?
Freaking out, man. I'm being followed. I saw them.
Don't be ridiculous. You're being paranoid.
So you're the guy who got jumped for a couple of million. Wake up! Are you working for?
I don't want to die, man. Not like this.
We must fight these people. It's them or us, cousin.
What are you still doing here? Get out of my sight, or I'm kidding. Let him know. Mine is right.
I told you to be calm. You halted the jump.
Welcome to America.
Stop shooting people, you maniac!
Leave my people alone.
I ain't asking you, I'm telling you, do this!
So you in, big guy? Or we're gonna have to kill you.
Well, since you put it that way, I'm in.
So it's interesting because like a lot of that's in there. The fact that I don't know, it was like 2007 when I got that job, and that was kind of when indies were becoming a thing, and you would learn about these people who are making these very personal things, and so this job just felt very fitting for a number of reasons. And the media that I ended up having to spend a lot of time with was celebrating a city that has been through a lot, and then also I kind of had to like dive into learning about movies, and also because like all that footage is stuff that's like captured in game, and that game had a lot of references to like other movies that were about New York, so it just got me to really think about the city, and I started exploring like and learning about that large scale open world. It led me to a bunch of realizations, and I remember having some uncanny valley with that city. Like, I don't really understand why they're like, it's maybe hard to see here, but like that's a burger stand, and those don't exist in New York. Like, it comes from like a very like looking at people who came to New York and saw stands. Like hot dog stands don't even exist anymore. So like that was really weird to me. And there was this obsession with Times Square in the game, and Times Square is probably one of the worst places in New York. It's where New Yorkers try not to go if they don't have to. I wouldn't be here if not GaymerX. And also like areas like they kind of erased my neighborhoods, which I thought were important areas, but like going to the Bronx area in the city, it felt very much like where I grew up because of, I don't know, it just showed me that like the Lower East Side could also look very much like another part of the city, and that's funny that I found that through that game. And also it gave me the sense that sheer scope that was needed to make the game of that scale, it's still missing a lot. And there was something about that immenseness that made the flaws of the world so much more apparent. So what I won't be talking about in this talk are games like these, like SimCity, City Skylines, Mini Metro. And these games are fine in their own, but they treat cities as top-down simulations and really don't deal with the nitty-gritty on the street. Because for me, a city is more than these easily quantifiable stats that are thrown into a generator. So when designing Treachery Beatdown City, I had to either consciously or subconsciously look at several different aspects of what making a game set in a city entailed. So, first of all, why a city? Why make a game in a city? Like, especially thinking, you look at a lot of people and they're like, oh, I wanted to make a Mario, or I wanted to make a Zelda, and I think I didn't want to do that. And I think I didn't want to do that also because a lot of the indies in 2008 were like, I'm making a game like Mario. But also, why wallow in the somewhat hopeless waters of New York when I could escape? What's kind of interesting is, like, Mario started in Brooklyn. So when we, and this is also doubled down on when they released the game again in 1994. Like, it got even more apparent that he was in New York City, and then got tripled down on recently, which is, it's kind of weird because, like, putting Mario next to, I guess, realistic proportioned people really, caused that existential, like, is Mario even a person? Like, or are these people? So, like, it's interesting because, like, cities are all about, like, the human element, and they create this clash. And when you think about, like, building a city, you have to think about some things, like the environment. What does the city look like? How do you represent the city? What is the scale of things? Like, when you go from this conveys a city, and this conveys a city almost equally. Like, do I need this when I have that? How do you navigate the environment? What does level design look like? Again, you can actually see that there's, like, little nodes here, then you play little levels, and here there's this immense world. How do you deal with density of crowds, density of buildings? What themes go really well with a city? Who's in the city? Why are we engaging with them? What goes on the meta level of the city? And so the why really came out of genre, because beat 'em ups, I don't really know why I wanted to make a beat 'em up, actually. It just popped into my head and said that was a good idea, but it also didn't hurt that Double Dragon, the arcade version, and Ninja Turtles, the arcade version, both games I hadn't really played as a kid. I only played the Nintendo versions because I didn't really have money to go to the arcade. They were the first two things to pop on Xbox Live, and that was really cool. Like, it reminded me of the genres that I loved because the genre had kind of disappeared. And I found it really strange that the first big hit arcade title that was like a new game in this genre, when I had just been reminded of these games that had all this nuance and dealt with cities, was Castle Crashers, which in a lot of ways, like, if you really analyze it, it's this regression in form in terms of player character differentiation, which Ninja Turtles is too, but Ninja Turtles came out in the 80s, and Castle Crashers has the same character differentiation of colors, but pretty much everybody's the same. So, 20-year difference, but similar themes. When Final Fight had changed the genre and differentiated all three characters would be different. And the game kind of just felt very insincere. Like, it's just this wacky Newgrounds style. But to its extent, like, it's a solid game, and much of what built it were things that, you have to kind of actively ask. Like, now we were working with 16:9 as opposed to 4:3, and how did they deal with walking from screen to screen? But also, just them releasing this game gave me the courage to think about working on in that genre. And that leads me to thinking about, how do we represent space? So creating a city is tough. It's a place, it's a space where, people need to be able to infer that the grandiosity of the city is there. And in recent games, a few games have been doing it. Even the Ocean is one. It has a very, very interesting looking city, very futuristic city. You have Transistor, which often you don't see these landscapes, but they're there. And this, you just by walking past this, you say, oh, there's a city. Or then you can even go a little crazy, and like this game Home Free, still being worked on, but it's an open world game where you're a dog. And also is tackling a lot of these issues of what it's like to be in a city. And even though the cities are huge, you don't really need a full city to get the feel for it. In fact, you actually can't use the whole city. I used to be in awe of these things, but when you start realizing, like, all you need is a skybox or a really good background to infer that there's a larger city at hand or other elements. Speaking of that, in the movie Attack the Block, the entire story takes place in and very close to one specific project building in London. Everybody knows that it's in London. It didn't need to much more than a few scene changes to let you know that they were changing floors. And there were some outdoor spaces, and it was set at night, so you'd assume less people were out. There were a lot of people shooting off fireworks, which you didn't see the people shooting off the fireworks, you just saw them, so then you had this assumption that there were people around. So this is basically almost all the people that are in the movie are represented here. There's maybe 3 other people and a couple of cops and a lot of aliens. But because of the fireworks and because of all the things, they basically tell the story that it's in a big city without needing more than a building. So then coming back to it, we have to think about how we traverse space because like this is the first like background for my game, and it doesn't look like this at all anymore. And it was basically me thinking, well, let me throw this in, let me see what this looks like in a 16:9 ratio, and how do you experiment with it. And for comparison, like this is the whole first level of Double Dragon, just the top screens. So it's only a few screens long, and the time that you can complete this is like 5 or 10 minutes or something, and none of that's bad. In fact, it's what makes the game great. The interactions are metered, and they do not wear out the welcome. And you also kind of have a fairly slow walk speed because the fighting is very purposeful. And you don't want to be there for very long. You want to just get in and get out and go on to the next level. And in general, beat-em-ups are about short bursts of play with very focused interactions. And unlike fighting games, there generally aren't any spectators, so the world has to look fairly empty, actually. So, and then looking at the 16:9 nature of things, like the levels are, like each screen is almost double the size. So then I had to think about, well, how do I get players around if I want to make a bigger city? And so I started kind of thinking about this. Like this is Zelda 2, which looks PowerPoint's destroying the GIFs. And it became clear that, so when you look at this, like Link walks around, then gets into a fight, then goes to a side-scrolling thing, then leaves. So then you have this idea that you've gone and done all this stuff on this bigger screen, and now you're somewhere else, and you can keep on going with your day. And also thinking about it, cities have a lot of different configurations, but New York specifically has this grid system that everybody talks about. They always talk about how it's easy because of the grid, and that's something that people really value, and it's valued. This is the Grand Theft Auto 4 map. This is the ROM map that also is, that seems to, it's funny because the background is a grid, but the city is anything but, because it's based in Oakland, right? San Francisco, yeah. So it's based in a place that's very not grid heavy. But then when I was working on Corporate Vandals, I also made the city a grid and made the rules that the city could operate on the grid, but that anyone doing any sort of graffiti or any other like street-based stuff could operate wherever they wanted, which actually kind of confused people at first, because they saw the grid and they thought the grid was something that they had to adhere to. So when I started making the game, Treachery Beatdown City, this is basically like what I thought of first. I thought of where things would go, because you don't want to start making art without thinking about it. And so this is kind of how like the game kind of evolved a little bit when I started actually putting down art, and I started thinking about like what buildings would look like, how the scale would look, and then I started filling it out a little more, trying to link the buildings and trying to think about like how players would walk around the environment. And I even got into the point of making landmarks, like this terrible, terrible landmark that's now in the Lower East Side that basically pained my life, the blue condominium, which basically it's called the blue condominium, and I feel like it looks like a sore thumb, like you're just looking at all this stuff and there's this giant thing. But even though it looks like a sore thumb, it's also more like a middle finger to everybody who lives in the city around, because it's this giant like thing of opulence. So you have to include things like that. So I started thinking about those little details, but I really hadn't figured out how we were going to navigate the city. And then so I doubled down and worked on the detail a little more and started thinking about like, well, how will the player navigate this space? But when I looked at this, I thought about, well, if I'm making a grid and you can walk around and this other player, this enemy here, has all this space around them, and you could think about it as a game that you could just walk around and explore and do whatever you want, but like you have to think about it that way. When you're making a game, like Zelda's an open world game, you can go wherever you want, you can pick any level to go into. There is basically nothing that is gating you in this game other than needing a couple of tools, but people beat this game with just bombs. So there's literally nothing gating you. And thinking about the Ninja Turtles on the NES, this was also another thing. If you look at the red circle, that's where you start. I don't know why whoever made this map put the starting point at E, and it's actually kind of interesting because when I was doing a lot of this exploration before I started working on the game, like hardcore. And this is an excerpt from an article I wrote for my own website in 2012. Where I talked about the genius of Ninja Turtles on the NES. Traversal of the first part of the game world gives the player two interesting choices on an otherwise linear path at all times. Each choice is essentially a fork in the road, giving the player the option to walk along the top-down overworld or enter the building or sewer. These splits aren't presented in the usual fashion, as there are no set guides telling the player he has to pick one or the other. Regardless of what the player picks, both choices come with appropriate risk and reward. And the risk and reward here is if you go in the tunnel, you have to fight a lot of enemies, but if you walk along the top, there are these tanks that will kill you in one hit if you run into them. But it kind of also lets the player that this game has no continue, so if you start over, maybe you don't want to go down there. Maybe you know how to avoid those things, so it's a kind of a difficulty by player choice. But I didn't want to give all this freedom. I wanted to create a game that had a proper on-ramp. A lot of these games didn't focus on teaching players any of these skills, and that's fine. That's what we really love about them, but I had to think about it sort of different. Also, just again, this is kind of funny because this picture on the right is people when they were first playing this game in the first night, and a lot of them were kind of having to think, and they were a little confused. If you see a lot of these things a lot of them are still on the grid, and it's because people weren't thinking about, when I kept telling them, you don't have to use the grid, and they kept saying, what do you mean? I said, only the city does, because only the city has to abide by any of the rules. And over time, people started to figure it out. So thinking about the grid, again, I had to figure out how to break the grid because I wanted to do the grid. And so I started thinking about this convenient inconvenience. To avoid what could have been confusing to players, I decided to take advantage of what could be inconvenient to everyday people in a city. Rarely do people see this as an inconvenience. Rarely do people see these barricades right there. They don't say, why are these barricades there? They're like, damn, whoever put those barricades there, but I guess I got to go over here. Most players, when they start here, they don't say, man, I really want to just go over there. But if they do, they don't blame me. They blame the invisible people that put those barricades there, which then kind of makes the world seem bigger. There's a garbage truck at the bottom, so you obviously can't go that way, and there are these barricades there. So you have to go left. That's basically no one ever just tries to go right. And also, kind of part of this comes from the node system. So if you look at this screen, this shows the original, and then what, like, my compromise there. Walking around would have been very weird. Like, you either have to reduce player movement to be along a strict line, like Zelda games did, or you could kind of let them walk all around. But that becomes a lot of wasted space. And so here, I wanted to actually not waste people's time and created a node system where people just go. Once you go, you just go, and you go and fight enemy. You go pick up item. Picking up items is still your choice. Talking to these NPCs is still your choice, but enemies are always in your way, and that's the only way to get through them. And it keeps the whole pace of the game feeling like those left to right beat 'em ups, because you can only ever go forward, and it keeps the feeling of the genre intact, even though it's a very weird distillation of it. So now I want to talk about density. Density in cities can be defined by a lot of things: density of population, density of buildings, density of information. New York, if you look at New York City down in the bottom right, you can just see it's like such a dense area. It's one of the densest, or if not the densest city in New York, or in New York, in the country. And, density is not actually great for games in a lot of ways, because games have technical limits. They have all these different issues. Once you start including density, you have things like GTA, which has been criticized for having the same vehicle have to repeat over and over again, and a lot of times that's for a reason. Like, you can't have 200 different vehicles on the screen at the same time, because that would be rendering all of them. Here you see a lot of cabs. But then there's also things like unnecessary density in heavy rain. Pay attention to the crowd. I mean, in this scene, there are so many pedestrians. People pop on and off. It becomes comical where everyone's stepping on top of each other, sliding around. They're all kind of blank-faced. And often you can see that they're all the same person, wearing the same clothes. And here's the kind of like where they just ramp everything up.
Jason!
You just see people like doing these awkward slides to the left and right. And this, I mean, I understand.
Jason!
Like, I understand that was for very specific reasons, but like, that woman in the background is the same character as the woman in the foreground, but that's like a main character. And if you look at it, the characters pop on in the background. This is a cutscene. Like, this is not even you playing the game. If you look at these people, there's just people sliding around as they're running into each other. And this is like a fully scripted moment. And I mean, I think we found him. There's right there. There's 3 of him. And I mean, it's even noticeable in smaller games, like this new Shin Megami Tensei trailer. Just look at the left and right. This is the same woman. Gifts. And this guy is not doing anything, and then he starts walking, and then he slides around that person, and then there's the same person's on the end. It's interesting. Like, it's mostly, density is kind of difficult. And on the other side, you can have emptiness in the world. Max Payne is a relatively empty city. They had this caveat for it, though. It was winter, and there was a terrible snowstorm, and this left the emptiness of all the environments to be a statement of trouble. Basically, anyone you saw was out to kill you. In Garrow Mark of the Wolves, this fighting game background, the world is fairly empty, but there is a density of things happening. Details fill out the life in the city. Lights flicker, mist comes up from the sewer, and there's a train overhead. And it's kind of hard to see with the lights on this, but there's someone in the background behind that car just kind of waving. And, you know, you get this idea of a city that's alive, and no one is really there to enjoy it except for the combatants on the screen. But then you get other side of emptiness because of technicality. In We Are Chicago, the world is very noticeably empty, and this seems to be empty because of technical constraints. Making a crowd is tough, and if you aren't up to it, as I'd say many aren't, just because of the difficulties, it's perfectly fine to go with like a top-down 2D route instead of showing noticeably empty walls. This is a screenshot from the Steam page, by the way. I think this game, like if you look at this, there's one person very, very far away, and it just leaves the city feeling overly empty. So, I mean, density is hard. And I think, you know, if you wanted to really go for like a city, you could go with something like Always Sometimes Monsters, which just goes for a standard, does like a lot of city-like stuff, but it uses RPG Maker to make the whole city. So, question I had to ask myself was, how do we create a sense of density without a denseness of masses? First off, a lot of the art for the backgrounds is very dense. It's very information dense, and I wanted to avoid, because, you know, old beat 'em ups would repeat because of technical limitations, but we didn't have those technical limitations. So this would require trickery to avoid, though, because this is about 4 screens long, and in a game where we have a lot of this bespoke art, it would take forever to make whatever hundreds of these backgrounds. So these backgrounds are, you pop into a fight, you see a background or 2, and then you pop back out, and then you come back in and you see another background or 2, and they don't repeat in that fashion. So you can kind of come back in and out. And then also while studying cities, like I tried to do a lot of principal photography to do it, but then I just kind of found that Google Maps is a great example of how to find a 2D city to do side-scrolling art from. And I kind of stumbled into how my own city's very much in flux. Like if you look at this street, there's like that adult-themed store there, and there's the cash place, and the other places are closed. And that same city a year ago, the adult store's gone. There's windows in that building that used to have bricks over their windows, and it's just kind of interesting. So then part of this art also is about a city in flux. Like stores are boarded up. If you don't want to come up with another store, there's a lot of stores that are boarded up that all have the same green boards outside of them, or store for rent signs, or some sort of construction going on. And it's like, if you come to it and you go in and out of it, you will always realize you won't remember that it's the same exact thing, because you see that thing so often in like regular cities as it is. Oh man, no. Okay, so I guess I'm gonna skip that. So when traversing the map, we made a viewport that is set so that the player can not only see their next fight, but multiple fights ahead. This gives an illusion that out of all the space on the screen, people take up a large bulk of it. The screen also appears to be full because the buildings take up the other last part of it. The streets are, however, very narrow. The sidewalks are about as wide as the player. The player slips through gates and alleys that are barely wide enough for their sprite to fit in. This creates a tension with the world that our node-based navigation mitigates. Density in fights. Even with this 16:9 nature, and I was kind of still working with characters that weren't the largest. So enemies still kind of stay close to the player, and they don't try to be too far away from the player, but part of their behavior is that they stay a little bit away from each other, and they'll go to try to surround you if they can. And like doing a little thing like adding a mailbox into the fight just adds this. It's wider than the player. It closes the gap between the player and the next enemy, even though they are not actually that close to each other, and it just fills in that space, making the space feel very dense on its own. We also kind of have this UI density that we're really trying to avoid having overlapping stuff, but I feel like it adds this interesting. We kept it very simple. No player or enemy can have more than 3 afflictions or status buffs at the same time, but the closer you get to them, the more you're going to see these things overlapping with each other. And I like to think of it as the closer you are to your enemies, the less you know about what is going on with yourself, which I think works in and of itself. It was kind of a thing that happened systemically, but kind of just decided to roll with it. And then there's like things like the past density. There's how do you design a city that feels like a city when you obviously can't put everything in it. And this is a map that's like our next map that we're going to be showing off. And usually if you've played the game, there are no trees in it, because I didn't want to put trees on every street, because there's something about for me, like the trees that you see on a normal city block aren't important. You only really think of them when you see them in a large mass in a park. There are no streetlights on this map at all. There are no there are no cars actually. There's vehicles, but there are no actual cars. And this is obviously wrong about the city, but you have to make compromises, and some of these are compromises that deal with just the very idea of playing the game. Like you wouldn't want a tree or a lamp that would have to crowd the side-scrolling element of it. But in this map, we do have a lot of extra things. Like we have construction that takes up a lot of space, that just has this, that adds to the idea. We have a bike sharing system. It's bank sponsored. And and we have halal carts, which that's where you save. And it's kind of interesting because our whole team basically saved our lives one summer, where we just ate at a Rafiki's cart every single day, because the coffee shop we were working out of, their $6 sandwiches or $7 sandwiches were just too much. Like we needed to eat 2 or 3 meals per day. So spending $6 on a giant plate of rice with chicken and all the other stuff was really the way to go. And then of course garbage trucks, because they just add that little idea of whose truck is that, so it fills the void of where are all the vehicles, where are all the people. Thinking about color, it's interesting because like the original Double Dragon, this is the arcade version, it wanted to be like, it had this weird arcade realism to it. Like it wanted to be real life, even though what is going on with that texture for the ground, I don't even know. Like that just seems like a nightmare if you were having to put those bricks down. And so when it was translated to the NES, like they tried to keep that realism going, and you can see that all the way through. They kept the palette super limited, and you kind of have to ask why. And maybe they did this because of where they were about to go next. But once you leave the city, it becomes this, like the skies become purple. The caves are pink and turquoise. It's interesting because like I feel like they were developing the game later and they figured out how to put more colors in there, or they just wanted the outside of the city to feel very different than the inside of the city. But, you know, the city in the sequel looks like this. They got rid of gray, and they just put purple, blues, and everything. And they kept this, it's actually a slightly more muted palette because there's less colors in it, but it's a lot brighter. And even later, with Mighty Final Fight, it kept going, and they decided to just put neon colors all over the place in the game. And that's also kind of fitting because when Double Dragon came back, it's Double Dragon Neon, and it's not the colors of the arcade, it's the colors of the time period. That was what they were really stressing, that this was a game set in the 80s, and the 80s are all neon, so put 2 and 2 together, and when you look at them side by side, it becomes very, very apparent. And there's also, you know, the color of, like, failure or attempting to just live your life in a very difficult situation. This is a Cart Life, and it's a game that's about like the futileness of trying to be a cart worker, essentially, like someone who does like newspaper stand or sells food or anything like that. Like you basically live a very, very fruitless and a life that's not fun at all, and you can tell just from the very beginning. Like it just has this air of sadness, and you know, even details are weird. Like in the trailer, the picture on the left, you can see that the sparks on the train are red, but the sparks on the train in the actual game became blue. And we actually had a dialogue about whether or not we wanted to put those sparks, if we wanted to reshoot everything because of the blue sparks, but people liked the shots. And it's just kind of interesting that that was like a little detail that somebody had to think about. Do we change the sparks to blue or from the red sparks? And then there's street art, which plays a lot into it. And this is street art, you know, it can say a lot about a city while being actually made by people who are having issues in the city. This is a piece by Scheme. It's like a real graffiti piece. You look at Rom. We also have our own graffiti, which is all over the place, which actually is slightly corporate sponsored graffiti, which is interesting. Like we have, or also non-profit sponsored, like we have DMG. Some of these are Kickstarter backers. Some of these are just people who helped out, created like a Basquiat, Baby Castles bear. But some of the other posters are just like the kind of wheat pasting that goes on in a city, because these are brands that are actually in the world. Because thinking about the world as these are things that go in it is better than just trying to tell people things to do in the world with your graffiti, because that's not really what street art's about. If you want to know more about street art, I would definitely say check out Style Wars and Wild Style. Style Wars is a documentary, and while Wild Style is a creative, it's a fiction art movie about a graffiti artist that stars graffiti artists. That was pretty interesting. This guy, Charlie Ahern, is a director. He's a white guy who was in the city, and instead of trying to just make this thing on his own, he decided to actually work with the people in the city. Who'd have thunk? You know, not street art. This is pictures from Kotaku, where about a piece that said, "Stop putting in this terrible street art." Because it's like, what happens when the food runs out? It's like nobody's going to write that. So now, you know, what's a city without people in it? And so a large part of Stretching Beatdown City comes from my own personal anxiety with dealing with the masses in the streets. People want your time. They block your path. They stretch out on subway seats. They catcall. They mistake you for someone else. They ask, "What are you?" When designing these enemies, they were based on a couple of things. They were based on people I saw on the streets, archetypes that were in my head of those people, cops who stepped over the line, a lot of things. And this game is also a game about because it's an RPG, also they have like class types. So there's like class and then there's class. And so these characters need to be readable. And once you see one, you have to have this idea of who they're like, what they're going to fit in, like from a gameplay standard. And so designing encounters was kind of interesting, because when I was working on this game, I thought of like you think of class and you think who's going to go together, but then you think of class and you think who is going to go together, and like things like socioeconomic status, race, and there were other things like, you know, like even like sexual preference and all these things. Like there's a lot of nuance to this thing because I made this and no one else needs to look at it because I design all the fights. So there's ideas like, you know, certain people like Abby as a character who just hates men, so you'll never put a man in a fight with them. But then there's things like I would keep Black and Latinx people, they wouldn't usually be aligned with the police, for one. And although there's actually a Latinx police officer who basically ignores all those elements of her complex stuff to basically be an oppressor towards the Puerto Rican woman that you're playing as, so we tried to put all that in there. But I found that this grid I've had to break a lot because I started like putting myself in a sort of a corner by creating my own sort of segregation based on things. And I just want to dive into this story which also shows that these things often overlap and become a lot more interesting because of that. So one day I was in Wendy's because the 4 for $4 special is amazing, and it's what basically feeds us these days. And there were these 2 white crusties, which are like crust punks, which are supposed to be like anti-capitalist people who live on the street. But they were demanding to use the bathroom at the Wendy's from a black dude with a thick accent behind the counter, and they were telling him he was discriminating against them because of how they looked. And not to mention the fact that they were obviously not customers, and there was like 5 of them right outside with signs like asking for money right outside the Wendy's. So they were creating this problem for this guy behind the counter. But the thing that got really crazy was when the impassioned speech about discrimination threatened, it was one of the crusties decided to say he would call the police because of this discrimination. And this was ignoring the fact that their act of existing in this world is a decidedly anti-capitalist. The police are a product of a capitalism-driven state. And this black man behind the counter is, by his very nature, at a disadvantage in that state, even though he was in a state of power at that point of being able to give over or not the ability to use the bathroom. But he's also probably in this place where he's making minimum wage and doesn't really have an option. Like, if he lets people use the bathroom that aren't customers, then he might get fired. So then he might have to go look for something else. But this also just shows that breaking the grid of sorts. Like, people will often reach over socioeconomic status or beliefs or ideology when they feel like it will benefit them the best. So some takeaways. So cities are multi-tiered, multifaceted, and diverse. They bring people together, but they also create a lot of conflict. You don't have to be from the city to make something about the city. Paul Verhoeven directed RoboCop, and he's from the Netherlands. And it's about like corrupt Detroit, and it's basically the only thing I knew about Detroit besides that cars were being made there. I basically used to say that, as far as I know, RoboCop is happening in Detroit. But he talks, I went to a panel where Paul Verhoeven just talked about making it, and the overarching idea was just RoboCop's Jesus, and because he gets and if you watch the movie, there's a part where he gets stabbed in the side with a spear, and there's a part where they're fighting on top of water, and there's all these things so the plot was like RoboCop is Jesus and fascism's bad. Those were the 2 big things for Paul Verhoeven. So the fact that it was in a city, that was that was the world building part, but you can be not from any of this stuff and still make it. Cities can benefit from smaller scope. This is my Nietzsche by Maddie Bryce, and it's a very small game that's about leaving just trying to leave your house and go meet up with somebody, and it's great because it's great in the not great parts of the city, and that there's a lot of harassment and stuff in it, but it's kind of the only way to actually show it, and it's super short, so it's worth playing, but it's also worth thinking about because the city just brings people together, and then these things happen. Then there's also that, cities can look like whatever you want to. This is a painting by Carrie James Marshall, and it's a painting that's a commentary on how oftentimes people live in places that are called gardens, but there's basically no greenery to be seen. They're just projects. You can also make your city look whatever you want. This is another Harlem Renaissance painting. It's like making your city feel like a city takes effort, but the things that you add versus the things you subtract tell the entire story. There's also the issue of cyberpunk, and ROM does this well. It's intersectional cyberpunk, but cyberpunk generally tends to just be white dudes killing other white dudes, erasing black and brown people, and basically trying to ask this question of, can a white man be a person? The new Blade Runner is that, and it's just okay, yes, I guess, but while just marginalizing everybody else in the city. And when you're making a city, it's probably best, even you're making something based on fantasy, it's best to not erase the people that live in that city. They come to Harlem. there's a brown goblin in the movie, and I'm like, but that's not a black person. Like I don't know the goblin's plight, right? Like, but like it's really weird because she's like a singer off to the side. I'm like, you can't replace like black people with brown goblins, right? Also, why would they're a goblin? Like, why would they be in Harlem? Like, I don't know. Like, is that Goblin Town? I don't know. This movie decided not to answer that. So one last thing.
Don't call me nigga, a rapper. My motherfucking name is Michael Eagle. I'm sovereign, I'm from a line of ghetto superheroes. I holler, I got something to bring to your attention. Attention, 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 attention. I promise you I will never fit in your descriptions. I'm giant, don't let nobody tell you nothing different. They lying, a giant in my body is a building, a building, a building, a building. No surfaces underground, no sound when I'm calling home. City broke and my brothers down, now I'm standing here all alone. Some weather my monochrome but my hollow bones. David Bowie told me I'm not alone. Now I'm overgrown with these model homes. Still here if it's hot or cold, still here if my body move. Still standing on Cottage Grove, still do what I gotta do. Stone tablet on stone tablet, I'm old granite, I'm not a tomb. Y'all can move this whole planet, I'll hold fast and I'll follow through, I promise you. The shelters, basement, hallways, early morning, Sunday, midnight, all day. Do what the adults say, don't engage in horseplay. People speak in tongues. Don't call me nigga, a rapper. My motherfucking name is Michael Eagle. I'm sovereign, I'm from a line of ghetto superheroes. I holler, I got something to bring to your attention. Attention, 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 attention. I promise you I will never fit in your descriptions. I'm giant, don't let nobody tell you nothing different. They lying, a giant in my body is a building, a building, a building, a building. My other name is 3925. Make sure that my story's told. 16 is so stories high. Constructed 55 years ago. Winter weather, yeah, here we go. Shot town in my building code. Stood here for 10 million snows. Wind chilled is all in my bones. Indivisible, indivisible. Kids and criminals, young and old. No radiated my dungeon code. Thunder humping you something slow. 20 down and just one to go. City say they gon' knock me down. Still wearing my iron hood. Told y'all you won't stop me now. I mean, nigga, a rapper. My motherfucking name is Michael Eagle. I'm sovereign, I'm from a line of ghetto superheroes. I holler, I got something to bring to your attention. Attention, 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 attention. I promise you I will never fit in your descriptions. I'm giant, don't let nobody tell you nothing different. They lying, a giant in my body is a building, a building, a building, a building.
So yeah, it's a song by Open Mike Eagle. It's about the whole album, which is the art that you saw before, the people as buildings. It's about Chicago and about his building that was just destroyed, like a project building. And it's like, you can tell a lot. That's not even the whole song, and that's just one song on an album. But just one way to represent a city. Thank you. Question. Yeah.
The game's called Beatdown City, right?
Yeah, Treachery and Beatdown City. So the question was about if the game Treachery and Beatdown City is out. It's not out. It's coming out next year. Yeah. Hi. Yes.
One of the things you brought up Blue Condo and other kind of ugly, awkward buildings. My first thought when we saw that was thinking about stuff like the renovations and so forth in Chicago, where it's like you do it, it's like an office.
Yeah.
I was wondering, like,
Okay. So yeah, the question, this is for the stream. This question is for about how to handle incongruous architecture in the city. And actually, because like the streets that I build are basically what I want, and you know, streets in the city can be very repetitious because they are kind of all parts of buildings. So what I do is I actually like embrace it. I take that building and I will put it right next to something that's like a construction site versus next to a building that either used to be there. You know, like I will take an entire neighborhood. Like I had to take the Lower East Side or like Soho or something, and you reduce that to 8 to 16 screens. And basically what I do is I try to pick things that I create this weird, I like to embrace the incongruity of things and make it look like, obviously, like this is kind of fucked up what's going on. Like you have, that's why I try to put like a lot of store for rent. That's actually something that I stumbled on when I was looking, is I had to, because of a gameplay feature adding zooming, I had to add extra space to a bunch of screens. So I started adding new art, because instead of taking old art, like smart thing to do, I wanted to add new stuff. And I started going through Soho and seeing how many buildings were going, or how many buildings were up for sale or under construction just like 3 years ago. So I try to, like, part of the scale of the city is I want it to look like a city influx. So we'll put a really ugly new building next to a really nice, like, kind of ratty older building, because I want that to be very apparent. So I try to really embrace it. Anything else? Yeah.
In terms of like gentrification, obviously just like the differences between like this very old crumbling building, this really nice building that represents it well, but how do you represent that, and also the citizens? That's not just like, because when I thought about asking this question, I thought, oh, it's just like a lot of white people in one area, that's too much, but video games do that too well already. So I was just curious, how do you still represent that? And I don't know if that's something you're approaching with treachery, but like how, for games of even more larger sizes like GTA, how can they handle something like that?
I feel like part of it comes from just making it really I think a key thing is making it apparent that like people that are of all like shape, sizes, socioeconomic classes, and race, everything, that they all have kind of like that there's like equal issues between everyone, but also, you know, you can highlight it. Like the thing is that in our game, like the lady on the top left next to the guy in pink, actually the guy in pink is kind of like a prepster, so he's kind of like he's a gentrifier, definitely, and he has kind of like buffing skills. So then in a fight with him, with her, who's like, she's a brawler cop who is basically just out to ruin your day, he or the lady in blonde 2 spaces over, they make the cop more powerful. So then it's like you have to kind of think about, in the context of the fight, like, who do you get rid of first? Like, and is it easier to get rid of like a rogue police officer when the gentrifier is not around? And that's actually kind of something that came out of like this weird grid here, was taking people and putting them down. Like it made me start, and then we started playing the game and saying, that's interesting. Like this person that, yeah, okay, we thought about it. We thought, let's make people who are obnoxiously gentrifiers. But then putting them in those positions just by thinking about this is what would happen in real life, then it created this weird metaphor for what goes on in real life, that the gentrifiers do make the police more powerful. So, I mean, I feel like you just have to, I have this whole other talk that I want to talk about, like, that I've been thinking about, like, you know, we have things like systems in game design, but people don't seem to think about, like, the systems in real life that those tie into. Like, the same reason they're mostly, like, white and East Asian developers in the games industry is the same reason. Like, it's a real system, right? It's based on real systems that go back decades or hundreds of years. So it's like systems of power. So it's like people have to make those systems in games, but they seem to ignore it. They decide to make games where white men listen to weird ghost elf fascists that go enslave a bunch of brown orcs. And yeah, as also was covered by Austin and Cameron Kunzelman on Waypoint recently. But I think that's it. If anybody wants to come check out the game, we'll have it in the indie space. Thank you.